Kristy Greenberg is the former deputy chief of the criminal division in the Southern District of New York. Anna Bauer is a courts correspondent for Lawfare. Both have been attending this trial and covering it very, very closely. I think it's fair to say, and both join me now. Kristy, let's start with you. I just read a statement from Barbara McQuade. And for those who are trying to understand how all of Trump's bad behavior could impact a sentencing, and again, I always like to state we don't know what the jury's going to do. That's up to them. How do you see it? Could that impact the sentencing?
I don't think it will. As much as this judge, I think, on a personal level, probably is not a fan of Donald Trump. I think that's probably an understatement at this point. I think he has to look at certain factors for sentencing, and Donald Trump saying nasty things about the judge personally is probably not going to be a factor that the judge will look at. The judge is going to look at the seriousness of the conduct that he's, if he is convicted, that he was convicted of. He's going to look at deterrence. What is it going to take to make sure this guy doesn't offend again and do the same kind of thing? General deterrence for others. He's going to look at, as Barbara said, violations of the gag order and promoting respect for the law. But under the gag order, Donald Trump is allowed to attack the judge. He is allowed to attack the process. He's not allowed to attack jurors, witnesses. And so those violations of the gag order, absolutely, I think the judge will consider. And the lack of remorse, I think, is a general matter. Donald Trump has been fighting his case, which is his right. But once he's convicted, if he is convicted and then sentenced, a lack of remorse really is something that judges look at. So if he keeps this up, if he keeps attacking the process after a conviction, yes, I do agree that that is something the judge would look at sentencing.
What about you, Anna? I mean, not to prejudge what the outcome is going to be or any potential sentence, but you've also been covering and watching this judge closely. Anything that you're watching or anything you think in terms of consequences or repercussions of Trump's actions?
Yeah, look, I think that Kristy is right that the previous gag order violations probably are something that Justice Merchan is going to take into account. He clearly took it very seriously. Trump has been held in contempt of court 10 previous times. And it's also notable as well that while Trump has recently been attacking the judge and Alvin Bragg, which he is allowed to do under the gag order, there have also been times recently at court that he's gone out and not by name, but by implication has been attacking members of Alvin Bragg's staff, which the gag order does, in fact, prohibit, specifically Matthew Colangelo, who used to work for the Department of Justice, and Trump has, by implication, suggested that there is someone from Joe Biden's DOJ who is running this trial, a seeming reference to Matthew Colangelo. However, prosecutors who have the burden, of course, of filing a motion to hold Trump in contempt have not taken the steps to file that motion. I think probably because we are coming up towards the end of this case, they want to keep things moving and don't want to, throw another wrench in the machine by bringing up another gag order violation. But I think that Justice Merchan is probably taking notice of these various public comments that Trump continues to say in apparent violation of the gag order.
So, I mean, Kristy, as Anna, we're near the end here. Well, sort of. We're closer to the end than we were a few weeks ago, I think it's safe to say, of this trial, at least. Tomorrow, the closing arguments start. In your view, what does the prosecution need to do, and anything that you're going to be particularly watching for?
So I worked with Alvin Bragg when we were prosecutors at SDNY, and one common technique in closing arguments, it's not always done, but it's done a lot of the time, and I actually think it would be good for this case, is to really point out for the jury what is actually in dispute and what is not in dispute, so that they can really focus on the issues that are before them to decide. And in this case, there is so much for the prosecution to point to that is actually not in dispute. Things like AMI working with Michael Cohen to catch and kill these Karen McDougal and Stormy Daniels stories, and the planting of negative stories against Donald Trump's opponents and positive stories in favor of Donald Trump. That's something that's nobody is disputed in the case. The Access Hollywood tape being a crisis for the Trump campaign, not in dispute. The fact that Michael Cohen was discussing the Karen McDougal payment with Donald Trump, that's on a recording. They can't really dispute that the recording says what it says. We heard it. And that the payments Stormy Daniels were delayed, that Michael Cohen made those payments after having to take out a home equity line of credit on his house, and then setting up this shell company to do it, that kind of whole secret mechanism, not in dispute. The fact that Donald Trump signed 9 of the checks to Michael Cohen, and that there were invoices that were attached to those checks, not in dispute. They're, I think, going to point out all of the tweets after FBI raided Michael Cohen, before saying, don't flip, and then after he made comments that Donald Trump directed the payments and they were for the financial benefit of Donald Trump. Then all of a sudden, the tweets that Donald Trump put out that were attacking Michael Cohen, and this, the sort of the pressure campaign beforehand, and then when he flips, attacking him. All of that, there's no dispute here that that happened. And so much of that is kind of corroborating Michael Cohen's story and the stories of the other witnesses about what happened here, that these payments to Stormy Daniels were made at the direction of and the benefit of Donald Trump.
I mean, there's so many details, as Kristy just outlined so well, that we've just learned, we knew, have been reiterated, and we know, or I think we can all expect, that part of the defense's strategy is going to be to continue to attack Michael Cohen's credibility. What are you going to be watching for in their closing arguments tomorrow?
Right. So I certainly think that in closing arguments, it's all coming up Cohen, so to speak, and that a big strategy here for the defense is going to be attacking Cohen's credibility on various fronts. They're going to attack his recollection. They're going to bring up this moment on cross-examination about that October 24th phone call to Keith Schiller, in which Cohen originally testified that he spoke to Trump about the Stormy Daniels hush money payment on that call. The defense, however, tried to suggest that there was another reason that Cohen could have made that call. They're also going to attack his motives. They're going to say that he's profited off of making podcast and media appearances about Trump. But beyond attacking Michael Cohen, I think that we're also going to hear a lot about causation. They're going to focus on that key element because the prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump caused these false entries in the books of the Trump Organization. And I think to that end, they're going to say that, there are other people who were involved in this who were the real causes. For example, they could point to Alan Weisselberg and to that, to the fact that Alan Weisselberg, the Trump Organization CFO, did not testify at this trial. I think that we also will hear a lot about intent to defraud or intent to cover up the other crime. They're going to focus on the fact that it's a lot of circumstantial, not direct evidence of intent here. So those are some of the things that I'm looking for. But I do think that Cohen's credibility is going to take the forefront of the strategy for the defense in the closing arguments.
No question. Before I let you go, Kristy, I just want to ask you, after the closing statement arguments, we will get jury instructions, or the jury will get instructions from the judge. What are you looking for in those, or what will be interesting to watch?
So this point that Anna made about the causation, I'm very focused on that piece in terms of the falsification of business records. We know that Donald Trump wasn't in the systems of the Trump Organization going through general ledger entries, but you can cause somebody else to make those entries, and that makes you guilty as well. If you did it indirectly, if you requested someone to do it, if you approved somebody doing it. And the prosecutors wanted an instruction saying that, well, the causing somebody to do it can be done if it's a reasonably foreseeable circumstance that those business entries would be made, given that you approved kind of the reimbursement scheme as a whole. And Juan Merchan seemed very reluctant to give that instruction when they were having argument about this in court. We haven't seen the final version to know if that's in there. So that is one thing I'm going to be looking for, because there really wasn't the direct evidence that he instructed anybody to make any particular entries in terms of the general ledger or the invoices. So that is one I'm going to be looking for. If they don't get it, I suspect the prosecutors will say, well, they were working in concert with one another. And so once he gave that instruction, he's essentially an accessory to this happening because he approved the general scheme. So I think they'll get around it, but it would certainly be better if they got that instruction. We'll see if they get it.
Lots of things to watch. Some different advice and views from the prosecution and defense with those jury instructions. Kristy Greenberg and Anna Bauer, thank you both so much for joining me on a Memorial Day. Appreciate it.